Hello everybody, this is Mike History 2, and today I will be talking about the history of Tonga. So Tonga in 1000 BC was a very different place. Only 3000 years ago there were no pigs, horses, dogs, cows, or rats, but most importantly, there weren't even any people. At this time the South Pacific was almost completely uninhabited. Any humans that existed were on the western fringes of the Solomon Islands, which I made a video about, and then around that time, these islanders were suddenly replaced by a new group that originated from the Bismarck archipelago off of Papua New Guinea, which I also made a video about. They stormed through the region, rapidly colonizing, pushing east. They brought with them new plant and animal species. Today, these people are named the Lapita culture after the location in France, and more specifically New Caledonia, where they were first noticed archaeologically. They reached Tonga around this time, but scholars still debate exactly when Tonga was first settled. But we know that settlers had arrived in the earliest inhabited town, Nukuleka, by 888 BC. Most likely the first islands that were reached were Tonga Tapu, followed by Ha'apai. Not much is known for sure about Tonga's history before European contact, because Tongans didn't write, but they did have an oral history, which had been passed down and was set down in writing after the arrival of the Europeans. However, what we do know is that the migration wouldn't stop, and many people left Tonga, becoming the Polynesians we know today, with Tonga becoming the origin of all people who came to inhabit the triangle created by New Zealand, Hawaii, and Easter Island, known as the Polynesian Triangle. By the 12th century, Tongans and the Tongan kings, named the Tu'i Tonga, were known across the Pacific, from Niue and Samoa to Tikopia. They ruled these nations for more than 400 years, sparking some historians to refer to a Tongan empire, although it was more of a network of interacting navigators, chiefs, and adventurers. It's unclear whether chiefs of the other islands actually came to Tonga regularly to acknowledge their sovereign. It is known that Tongans had traveled from the far reaches of Micronesia to Fiji and Hawaii. In 950, Tu'i Tonga, Aho Etu, started to expand his rule outside of Tonga. By the time it comes to the 10th Tu'i Tonga, Momo and his successor Tu'i Tatui, the empire had already stretched from Tikopia in the west to Niue in the east. The realm contained Wallis and Futuna, now in France, Tokelau, Tuvalu, Rotuma, Nauru, parts of Fiji, the Marquesas, parts of the Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Niue, Cook Islands, and parts of Samoa. Now, the success of, I guess, what we could call this empire was largely based on the navy, which allowed for Tonga to become wealthy with large amounts of trade and tribute flowing into the royal treasury. The Tu'i Tonga decline began due to numerous wars and internal pressure. In the 13th or 14th century, Samoa defeated Tu'i Tonga, Talakaifaiki, and in response, the Falifa was created as political advisors to the empire. There was also increased dissatisfaction, which led to the assassination of several rulers in succession. The most notable were Havea I, Havea II, and Takalawa, who were all known for their tyrannical rule. In 1535, Takalawa was assassinated by two foreigners while swimming in the lagoon of Mu'a. His successor, Kauulufonua I, pursued the killers all the way to Uvea, where he killed them. Now, because of so many assassination attempts on the Tu'i Tonga, Kauulufonua established a new dynasty called Tu'i Ha'atakalawa in honor of his father, and he gave his brother Mo Ungamotu'a the title of Tu'i Ha'atakalawa. The Tu'i Tonga Empire at this period becomes Samoan, and the Tu'i Tonga themselves became ethnic Samoans who married Samoan women and lived in Samoa. Now, in 1610, the sixth Tu'i Ha'atakalawa, Mo Ungatonga, created the position of Tu'i Kanokupolu for his half-Samoan son Ngata, which divided regional rule between them. Though as time went on, the Tu'i Kanokupolu's power became more and more dominant over Tonga. By the way, I'm sorry to the Tongans watching this, but your language is too hard. In the 15th century, and again in the 17th, civil war erupted. It was in this context that the first Europeans arrived, beginning with explorers Willem Schouten and Jacob Lemaire from Holland. Between April 21st and April 23rd, 1616, they anchored at the northern Tongan Islands, Cocos Island, known as Tafahi, and Traders Island, known as Nuatoputapu, respectively. The kings of both of these islands boarded the ships, and Lemaire drew up a list of Nuatoputapu words, but this language is now extinct. On April 24th, 1616, they tried to anchor at the island of Good Hope, which is Nuafo'u, but a less welcoming reception there made them decide to sail on and not get killed. Now, on January 21st, 1643, the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman, who I mentioned in my Australia video, was the first European to visit the main island, Tonga Tapu, and Ha'apai, after rounding Australia and New Zealand while looking for a faster route to Chile. He mapped several islands, and Tasman named the island of Tonga Tapu Amsterdam Island because of its abundance of supplies. Now, it's impossible to mention the history of Oceanian countries without mentioning James Cook, who visited in 1773, 1774, and 1777, as after this the Europeans began visiting Tonga more regularly. The islands were first visited by the Spanish under Francisco Antonio Morel in 1781 and Alessandro Malaspina, who unsuccessfully claimed Vavao for Spain in 1793, and by the French under Marc-Joseph Marion Dufresne in 1772, Jean-François de Gallo, Comte de la Pérouse in 1787, Fletcher Christian in 1789, and Antoine Brunet d'Entrecasteaux in 1793. So, in terms of religion, the first London missionaries arrived in 1797. The Methodist Walter Lowry in 1822. Around that time, most Tongans converted to Methodism or Catholicism. Other denominations followed, including Pentecostals, Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, and most recently, the Baha'i faith. In 1799, the 14th Tu'i Tonga Tuku Aho, was murdered, which sent Tonga into a civil war for half a century. Finally, the islands were united into a kingdom in 1845 by the ambitious young warrior, strategist, and orator Taufa Ahau. He held the chiefly title of Tu'i Tonga was baptized with the name King George Tupu I. In 1875, with the help of missionary Shirley Baker, he declared Tonga a constitutional monarchy, at which time he emancipated the serfs, enshrined a code of law, land tenure, and freedom of the press, and limited the power of the chiefs. The islands were not fully mapped until 1898, when the British warships HMS Egeria and HMS Penguin, 1873 and 1876 respectively, completed the task. On May 18, 1900, to discourage Prussian advances, the Kingdom of Tonga became a vassal of the United Kingdom, under a treaty of friendship signed by George Tupu II, after European settlers and rival Tongan chiefs attempted to overthrow him. Foreign affairs of the Kingdom of Tonga were conducted through the British Consul. The United Kingdom had veto power over foreign policies and finances of the Kingdom of Tonga. Now, Tonga was affected by the 1918 flu pandemic, with 1,800 Tongans killed, around 8% of the people. So for most of the 20th century, Tonga was quiet, inward-looking, and somewhat isolated from what was going on in the rest of the world. And it kept a complex social structure, which was essentially the three tiers: the king, the nobles, and the commoners. Now, where have I seen that before? On June 4th, 1970, protected state status of the Kingdom of Tonga ended, and this was arranged by Salote Tupu III prior to her death in 1965, which made Tonga completely independent. And this, however, because of this, it joined the Commonwealth of Nations that year, and then later the United Nations in 1999. Now, despite having been exposed to Europeans, Tonga has never been completely ruled by them, a fact that makes Tonga unique in the Pacific and boosts confidence in the monarchical system, which actually they still have today. King George Tupu V continued to have ultimate control of the government until July 2008. And at that point, concerns over financial irregularities and calls for democracy led to him giving up most of his actual power over the government. And so now we move to the 21st century. In the March 2002 election, supporters of the human rights and democracy movement won 7 of the 9 popular elected seats for people's representatives. Following the election, their leader, Akilisi Pohiva, was arrested and charged with sedition over an article published in his newspaper Kilea claiming that the king had a secret fortune, but this was later acquitted by a jury. In 2003, the Taimi o Tonga, or the Tongan Times, a newspaper published in New Zealand in Tongan that had been critical of the government, was banned from being distributed in Tonga due to the government objecting to its content. After the newspaper obtained 2 court orders, it was again distributed freely. A Media Operators Bill and constitutional amendment intended to restrict media freedom in Tonga was hotly debated in 2003. This law allowed the government to control what it considered cultural and moral issues, ban anything it deemed offensive, and ban foreign ownership of the media. So this caused, in October 2003, thousands of Tongans to peacefully march through the streets of the capital city, Nuku'alofa, an unprecedented demonstration against the government's plan to limit freedom of speech and freedom of the media. Despite the protests, the Media Operators Bill and the Constitutional Amendment passed the law, and as of December 2003, needed only the King's signature to become law. By February 2004, this was passed, and all news media needed to have a license. So those newspapers which didn't have a license included, well, not surprisingly, the Tongan Times, the ones that had criticized the government in the first place, and the only ones that were given licenses were either church-based or pro-government. At the 2005 Tongan general election, the Human Rights and Democracy Movement won 7 of the 9 popularly elected seats. Aho Etu Unuwaki Otonga Tuku Aho, son of the king, initially stayed as prime minister, but he resigned in 2006 after the Tongan Speaker of the House was found guilty of bribery. So then it passed to Feleti Sevele, who's the Minister of Labor and one of the 2 independent candidates elected, as well as the first non-noble prime minister of the country. In 2005, the government spent many weeks negotiating with striking civil service workers before reaching a settlement. A commission met in 2005 and 2006 to study proposals to update the constitution and was presented to King Taufa Ahau Tupu IV shortly before his death in September 2006. So, after he died, the public expected new democratic changes from the new king. On November 16, 2006, rioting broke out in the capital city of Nuku'alofa when it seemed that the parliament would adjourn for a year without having made any progress in increasing democracy. Government buildings, offices, and shops were looted and burned, and 8 people died in the riots. The government agreed that elections would be held in 2008, in which a majority of the parliament would actually be elected by the people. So the April 2008 election saw 48% turnout to elect the nobles' representatives and the 9 people's representatives. Most of the pro-democracy members were reconfirmed, and all elected members of parliaments were pro-democracy. About 2 weeks before the election, it was announced that the Tonga Broadcasting Commission would censor candidates' political broadcasts, and that the reporters would be banned from reporting on anything political. However, this was criticized as restricting freedom of speech. In April 2010, the Legislative Assembly enacted many political reforms towards a fully representative democracy, increasing the number of people's representatives from 9 to 17. This changes mean that 17 out of 26 representatives, or 65%, would be directly elected, up from 30%. However, the aristocracy would still select its 9 representatives, while all remaining seats, which were previously appointed by the monarch, would be abolished. Early general elections under the new law were held on November 25, 2010. And this was described as Tonga's first democratically elected parliament. The Democratic Party of the Friendly Islands, founded in September 2010 specifically to fight the election and led by pro-democracy campaigner Akilisi Pohiva, got the most amount of seats, with 12 out of the 17 people's representative seats. And because of this, it put forward bills to make the country more democratic, including the direct election of the Prime Minister, as well as universal suffrage for all 26 members of Parliament. However, these were not taken forward because Conservatives were a majority. Now, at the death of the King George Tupu V on March 18, 2012, his son Aho Etu Unuwaki Otonga Tuku Aho became King of Tonga with the name Aho Etu Tupu VI. Anyways, that's all. I hope you enjoyed. I definitely learned something new, and I hope you did as well. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you next time.